Welcome to Dad's Revenge, where quiet men prove that patience is a strength. Each story here is about a father who is underestimated, disrespected, or betrayed by the very people who should be protecting him, and how that father finds his own way to mend things. Welcome to today's story. At my daughter's wedding, her groom grabbed my collar and shoved a fistful of cake into my face in front of 200 guests. "Eat up, deacon," he laughed into the microphone. "We don't want people saying I let my broke father-in-law starve." I didn't wipe my face. I didn't raise my voice. 3 hours earlier, I'd already bought the $4 million debt that was about to bury him and the church pension fund he'd forged my daughter's name to steal from. If you want to know how a quiet man in a 20-year-old suit brought down a predator, keep listening. But to understand any of that, you need to see where this weekend actually started. I brought the old refrigerated truck down the gravel drive at a crawl, the diesel engine settling into that low, familiar rattle it always found on an incline. Meridian's newest tractors could climb this same hill without a sound, climate-controlled and whisper quiet, but I still drove the same box truck I'd bought second-hand 31 years ago, the crack in the driver's window never fixed, on purpose. Ahead of me, the restored hall in Hayti glowed gold against the evening sky, its brick facade lit for my daughter's engagement dinner. I eased past a line of German sedans and a white Rolls-Royce idling near the entrance, and found a gap at the far edge of the lot, half swallowed by shadow. I cut the engine and sat for a moment in the quiet, listening to the metal tick as it cooled. On the passenger seat lay my old Air Force cap, the eagle patch faded from 3 decades of sun. I picked it up, turned it once in my hands, and set it on my head before I climbed down. 28 years of hauling freight through hostile ports had taught me that a man walks steadier into any room when he's wearing something that reminds him exactly who he is. The invitation was still folded in my breast pocket, thick cardstock gold script. Tucked inside it had been a smaller note, hurried handwriting I knew too well, Georgia's note. "Wear something presentable," it said. "Stay near the back." I hadn't needed the reminder. I'd built Meridian cold chain from one leased truck and a line of credit no bank wanted to extend a black veteran in 1986, and in 38 years I had never once needed the room to notice me to know what I was worth. I straightened my jacket and started toward the steps. A young man peeled away from a cluster of groomsmen and planted himself directly in my path before I reached the entrance. His suit was cut close, his watch heavier than it needed to be, and his eyes did the quick, practiced sweep men like him always did, shoes first, then the rest. This was Zaire Skinner, the man marrying my daughter in 9 months. I recognized him from the photographs Aubriella had sent, though none of them had captured the particular way his mouth curled when he looked at something he'd already decided was beneath him. He didn't offer his hand. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a set of keys on a leather fob, and held them out toward my chest like he was handing off a chore. "Here, round back past the valet stand. There's a reserved row for the family cars. Mine's the black Range Rover out front. Mind the paint. It's brand new." He said it the way a man gives an order to someone he's already forgotten will answer back. I didn't reach for the keys. I stood with my hands loose at my sides and let the silence stretch a beat longer than was comfortable, watching a flicker of irritation cross his face when I didn't move to obey. "I'm not the valet," I said. My voice came out even the same register I'd used for 3 decades negotiating port contracts with men who liked to test whether a quiet man could be pushed. "My name is Alden Benson. I'm Aubriella's father." The keys slipped from his fingers and hit the brick walkway with a sharp, small clatter. For one unguarded second, something honest crossed his face, surprise, maybe even a flicker of something closer to fear, before he caught himself and bent to retrieve them. "Right, of course." He straightened, and the easy performance was already sliding back into place, though it sat a half-second late this time. "Aubriella mentioned her father might come through. I just wasn't expecting—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. He looked at my boots, my 20-year-old suit, and let the rest hang in the air between us, like something he'd decided not to bother saying out loud. He turned, without offering his hand, without a single word that resembled a welcome, and snapped his fingers at a security guard posted near the doors. The man jogged over, adjusting his earpiece. "Keep an eye on him," Zaire said, not bothering to lower his voice. "Make sure he doesn't wander into the private lounge or bother the catering staff. We've got people arriving tonight who matter." He said the last word with a weight that told me exactly where he'd decided I fit on that scale. The guard gave me an apologetic look and a small nod, the look of a man following orders he didn't fully agree with. Zaire had already turned his back, moving toward a cluster of men in tailored suits, his laugh rising loud and sudden as he reached them, arms wide, already performing for a new audience. I stood on the steps a moment longer, the evening air carrying the smell of magnolia and expensive cologne. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't needed to. In 38 years of reading men across a negotiating table, I had learned that contempt shown that quickly, that easily, to a stranger a man believes has nothing to offer him, tells you everything you need to know about what he's hiding underneath the suit. A man that's certain of his own power rarely needs to prove it to someone he thinks can't touch him. I adjusted my cap, felt the familiar weight of the eagle patch under my fingers, and walked through the door my daughter's fiancé had just decided I didn't belong through. Whatever this weekend was going to be, I already understood one thing clearly. It would not be simple. An usher in a black vest led me past the edge of the dance floor to a small table tucked against the kitchen's swinging doors. The one spot in the room where the string quartet's music thinned out and the clatter of plating dinner service leaked through every few seconds. I didn't ask for a better seat. A man who has to demand a place at the table has already lost the argument before he opens his mouth. I'd learned that lesson in rooms far colder than this one, sitting across from union bosses who wanted to see whether I'd flinch at being kept waiting. The room itself was a study in excess. Crystal chandeliers threw warm light across tables draped in imported silk, and orchid arrangements taller than the centerpieces I'd seen at corporate galas rose from every surface, each one worth more than a week's wages for the staff who'd arranged them. A string quartet worked through something classical in the far corner, their notes nearly swallowed by champagne laughter and the particular boastful pitch men adopt when they want strangers to overhear how well they're doing. Waiters moved in a steady current, trays balanced high, and not one of them so much as glanced toward my corner unless I raised a hand. I sat with my hands folded on the tablecloth and let the room move around me. To the guests drifting past, I registered as nothing more than an older man in an outdated suit, a small imperfection on an otherwise curated evening. That suited me fine. In 4 decades of building freight routes out of nothing, I'd learned that the men who needed a room to notice them were rarely the ones worth watching. The ones worth watching were usually sitting exactly where I was, saying nothing, missing nothing. A cluster of Zaire's people had gathered near a service alcove not 10 feet from my table, close enough that fragments of their conversation reached me under the music. 2 men in tailored jackets, a woman I didn't recognize, all leaning in with the particular tightness people get when they think no one important can hear them. "Kicked back again this morning," one of the men was saying, low and clipped. "Second time this week. If it bounces again before Monday, we've got a real—" "Keep your voice down," the woman cut him off, glancing past his shoulder. "I'm just saying, if Zaire doesn't get ahead of—" He stopped mid-sentence. His eyes had landed on me, sitting close enough to have heard more than he'd meant anyone to. A practiced smile slid onto his face, quick and easy, the kind men like that keep in reserve for exactly this situation. He said something about the caterer running behind schedule loud enough for the whole alcove to hear, and the 3 of them drifted toward the bar as if the conversation had never happened, laughing a beat too hard at nothing in particular. I didn't turn my head. I didn't need to. 28 years of logistics work teaches a man to log a data point the moment it crosses his desk, even when it doesn't fit anywhere yet. A transfer bouncing twice in 1 week wasn't proof of anything. Men mismanaged accounts for 100 small, boring reasons that had nothing to do with fraud. But it was a fact, now filed and dated, sitting next to the memory of Zaire's face going pale for half a second on the front steps. I caught myself doing it, cataloging, building a file before I'd even decided there was a case to build, and felt the old discomfort that always came with recognizing the habit in myself. It was the same instinct that had kept freight moving through hostile ports for 3 decades, the same one that had, if I was honest with myself, made me a better colonel than I'd ever managed to be a husband. Georgia used to say I treated our marriage like a supply chain, always scanning for the weak link before it could break, never simply trusting the load would hold. She wasn't entirely wrong. I had learned to watch for cracks so early and so constantly that somewhere along the way I'd forgotten how to sit in a room and let it just be a room. I made myself do that now, if only for a moment. I watched Aubriella's bridesmaids laughing near the dessert table, watched an older couple sway slow and easy despite the up-tempo music. Watched the ordinary, decent parts of a wedding weekend happening in the spaces between all the performance. My daughter was somewhere in this room, and somewhere beneath the tension I was already carrying, I wanted nothing more than to see her happy, whatever the cost of arriving at that happiness turned out to be. I reminded myself, the way I had to more often than I liked, that suspicion was a tool and not a way of loving someone. The alcove had emptied. The trio had scattered into the crowd, laughing too loudly near the bar, the moment already folded back into the evening as if it had never surfaced. I sat with the fragment a while longer, turning it over, the way I'd once turned over shipping manifests that didn't quite balance, looking for the single number that would explain the rest of the column. Nothing came. Not yet. I rose from the table, straightened my jacket, and moved toward the main floor to find my daughter before the night moved further away from me than it already had. Carrying the small, unfinished thread with me the way I carried everything I couldn't yet name. Quietly and without setting it down, I worked my way along the edge of the dance floor, scanning for Aubriella, but the crowd had thickened since I'd sat down, and every young woman in white or cream blurred into the next under the chandelier light. A bridesmaid told me kindly enough that the bride was still upstairs finishing photographs. I thanked her and made my way back to my table, deciding it was easier to let my daughter find me than to keep chasing a room that didn't want to make space for me. I'd barely settled back into the chair when Georgia appeared at my shoulder, moving with the brisk, managed energy of a woman who'd spent the whole evening making sure nothing looked out of place. She wore a silver clutch and a smile that had clearly been assembled for the cameras, the kind that showed teeth but never reached her eyes. That smile held for exactly as long as it took her to reach my table. By the time she stopped beside my chair, it had already collapsed into something colder. "I told you to stay near the back, Alden." Her voice dropped low enough that only I would hear it, though her posture stayed perfectly composed for anyone watching from across the room. "You're standing out. It's not a good look, especially tonight." "I'm sitting," I said, "not standing, and I read note." She ignored that. She reached into her clutch and drew out a folded $100 bill, crisp enough that it had clearly been set aside for this exact purpose. She pressed it into the breast pocket of my jacket and patted it twice, the gesture of someone closing a transaction rather than offering a kindness. "For gas," she said. "Leave early tomorrow if you can. We don't need any complications in the photographs." She held my eyes a moment longer, as if daring me to make a scene out of it, then turned on her heel and disappeared back into the crowd before I could answer. I sat with the bill folded neatly against my chest and let the insult pass through me without taking root. Georgia had spent 30 years believing that money was the only language I understood, and there was a certain mercy in letting her keep believing it. I reached into my pocket, smoothed the crease out of the bill, and set it on the table in front of me, deciding what to do with it while the band shifted into something slower. A young man came through the kitchen doors just then, no older than 19, balancing a tray stacked high with dirty dishes that trembled with every step he took. His collar was soaked through, and his eyes had the glassy, overworked look of someone who'd been on his feet since early afternoon without a real break. I remembered that look. I'd worn it myself, 22 years old and hauling crates on the Norfolk docks between drills, learning what it cost a body to keep moving long after it wanted to stop. As he passed close to my table, I slid the folded bill under the edge of his tray without a word. He glanced down, then up at me, startled, and I gave him a small nod before he disappeared back through the swinging doors. The $100 doing more good in his pocket than it ever would have in the gas tank of a truck I already owned outright. With that settled, I turned my attention back toward the center of the room, where Zaire had planted himself at the head table, holding court for a ring of admirers. He'd sent for 3 more bottles of the vintage champagne, the kind that ran close to $1,000 a bottle, and he poured it freely, laughing loud enough to carry over the music, playing the part of a man who'd never once had to check a balance before spending. The head waiter approached from behind him, discreet, carrying a small leather folder with the evening's charges. Zaire kept his smile fixed for the table as he flipped it open, but I was watching closely enough to catch what happened underneath that smile. His jaw tightened for half a second. The color dropped out of his face just slightly, just enough. His hand resting on the stem of his champagne glass gripped a fraction harder than the moment called for. It passed almost as quickly as it came. He signed whatever was in front of him, handed the folder back with a little too much force, and turned back to his audience with the same easy laugh as before, a beat too late to be entirely convincing. I sat back in my chair by the kitchen doors and let the noise of the party fade into the background. A man with $50 million behind him doesn't flinch at a dinner bill, doesn't grip a champagne glass like it's the only thing keeping his hand from shaking. I'd watched real wealth move through boardrooms and shipping offices for 4 decades, watched men sign contracts worth more than this entire wedding without so much as a change in their breathing, and it never once looked like what I was watching now. Real money is quiet. It doesn't need 3 bottles of vintage champagne to prove it's in the room. What I was seeing instead was performance stretched thin. Over something underneath it, a borrowed confidence that cracked open for half a second every time the actual numbers came due. I thought of the $100 bill I'd just handed off under a tray of dirty dishes, of George's certainty that I understood nothing but the value of a gas tank, and I let myself sit with the quiet satisfaction of knowing more than anyone at this table currently suspected I did. Whatever Zaire Skinner was building his life on, it wasn't what he told my daughter it was, and I intended to find out exactly what it was before this weekend was over. I found Aubriella standing near a tower of white orchids, radiant in a pale evening gown, though something in her shoulders sat too stiff for a woman celebrating her own engagement. She glanced past me toward the crowd before I'd even said hello, checking the way she always had since she was a teenager, whether anyone important was watching us together. "Hi, Dad." Her voice dropped low, hurried. "You should probably head back to your table. People are starting to notice. I just wanted to give you this." I reached into my jacket and drew out a small wooden box no larger than my palm. The mahogany grain polished until it caught the chandelier light. I'd spent 3 weeks in my workshop shaping it by hand, sanding the corners smooth, working late after long days at the terminal because it was the only quiet time I had. The wood wasn't new. It had come from the original deck boards of the box truck I still drove, salvaged the year I'd finally restored the cab and replaced the flooring, a set of offcuts I'd kept in a crate in my garage for longer than I could explain to anyone, including myself, until I finally understood what they were for. Her initials sat engraved into the lid, cut the same careful way I used to carve her name into the wooden blocks she'd played with before the divorce split our house down the middle. "For the ring," I said. "Somewhere safe to keep it." Something genuine flickered across her face for just a moment, a memory surfacing before she could stop it. Maybe the blocks, maybe something further back than that. Then the panic returned, and she snatched the box from my hands and tried to force it into her small clutch cheeks, flushing when it wouldn't fit, no matter how she turned it. "Thank you, Dad," she said, eyes on the floor. "I'll put it away. Just please go sit back down before Zaire sees us." It was already too late. I caught the cologne before I heard the footsteps, a thick, deliberate cloud of it announcing him before he'd said a word. Zaire stepped between us, his eyes locking onto the box still clutched in Aubriella's hands. "What's this?" His voice carried pitched for anyone nearby to hear. "It's nothing," Aubriella said, quickly shrinking the way she always did when he raised his voice near her. "Just a small gift from my dad." He didn't ask permission. He reached out and took it from her, holding it up under the light with the exaggerated care of a man inspecting something he already found beneath him. "Did you make this yourself?" He turned it over slow, performing for the small crowd that had started to drift closer, drawn in by the particular energy a public humiliation always seems to generate. "Looks like something off a card table at a yard sale. Real rustic charm." "Solid mahogany," I said, keeping my voice level. "A family tradition." He laughed loud and theatrical loud enough to pull heads from 3 tables over. "Well, Aubriella and I have better traditions now, ones that come in little blue boxes from Tiffany's." He turned the box over once more, tapping the lid with a manicured fingernail. "We don't have much shelf space in the new place for arts and crafts, but I'm sure we'll find a drawer somewhere." Aubriella looked away, unable to meet my eyes, saying nothing in the box's defense, saying nothing in mine. A waiter passed with a tray of drinks, and Zaire lifted a heavy glass of whiskey off it without breaking his gaze from me. He took a long, unhurried sip, then set the box down on a nearby cocktail table and placed the sweating glass directly onto its lid, the condensation already beating against the polished wood I'd sanded by hand. "Makes a decent coaster, though," he said, and turned back toward his circle of admirers, as if the matter were already closed. "Thanks for the contribution, Alden. Every little bit helps." I watched the water pull dark rings into the grain I'd spent 3 weeks smoothing, and every instinct built over 4 decades of boardrooms told me to close the distance between us and end this the way I knew how to end things when men crossed a line with me. I didn't move. I had negotiated with union bosses who wanted to see whether I'd break first, with foreign port officials who tested every American who came through their docks for the same weakness. And I had learned the same lesson every time a predator doesn't strike the moment prey tests the edges of the cage. It waits and lets the prey believe the cage isn't there at all. I reached out, lifted the glass off the lid before the ring could set permanently into the wood, and wiped the water away with the edge of my sleeve. Slow and deliberate, the way a man moves when he wants everyone watching to understand he isn't rattled. I set the box back down without a word to anyone. Aubriella still hadn't looked at me. I understood in a distant, aching way that she couldn't, that looking at me meant seeing what she'd allowed to happen, and she wasn't ready yet to carry that weight in front of a room full of people she was trying so hard to impress. I didn't tell her what the wood had come from. I didn't tell her that the offcuts had sat in that crate for 6 years because some part of me hadn't been ready to let go of the truck that carried us through the worst of the divorce. Or that carving her initials into it had felt like the only apology I knew how to give without using words neither of us would have known what to do with. Some things a father keeps to himself, even when handing them across a table wrapped in mahogany. I turned and walked back toward my own table, leaving the box and my daughter in the middle of a party that had no room left tonight for either one of us. I stayed at my table for the better part of an hour after that, nursing a glass of water while the party moved on without me the way it had all night. My mind kept circling back to small things that shouldn't have mattered on their own. A transfer bounced twice in 1 week, a hand tightening around a champagne glass, a $100 bill that had done more good in a busboy's pocket than it ever would have in a man's gas tank. None of it proved anything. But a man doesn't build a global freight network by ignoring 3 separate small facts that keep pointing the same direction. I watched Zaire work the room from a distance, laughing too loud, refilling glasses that didn't need refilling, performing for an audience that seemed content to keep applauding. Then his phone buzzed against the table and I watched something change in him, the laugh cutting off half a second too fast, his eyes dropping to the screen and staying there a beat longer than a casual text would warrant. He leaned toward Aubriealla, as said something I couldn't hear, and slipped away from the head table through a side door near the garden entrance, moving with the particular briskness of a man trying not to look like he's hurrying. Nobody else seemed to notice. I did.
I gave it 30 seconds, then rose and followed the same path he had, out through the heavy glass doors and into the cool night air of the back gardens. The manicured hedges and stone fountains sat dim under low landscape lighting, a world away from the noise still spilling out of the reception hall behind me. I kept to the shadows along the hedge line, my boots quiet on the gravel path, and let my ears do the work my eyes couldn't in the dark. I found him in a narrow alcove near the property's edge, alone, or so he thought. He wasn't holding the sleek phone he'd flashed all evening. He was gripping a cheap plastic burner, the kind you buy off a rack with cash, and his other hand was shoved deep in his pocket, fingers working against the fabric like he couldn't hold still. "You have to listen to me," he was saying, voice pitched low but cracking at the edges. "I know what the deadline was. I can't do this tonight. Not tonight. I'm standing at my own engagement dinner right now." Whoever was on the other end said something short. Zaire flinched like he'd been struck. "I'm not avoiding you," he said faster now, the polish gone completely from his voice. "I need 48 hours, that's it. Once the wedding's done tomorrow, I'll have what I need to cover this, all of it, plus interest, I swear it. Just don't send anyone else out here. You'll blow the whole thing up if her family gets spooked." Another silence. I watched his shoulders drop lower with every second it stretched on, watched the last of the confident, glad-handing groom from 20 minutes ago drain completely out of his posture. When the voice on the other end spoke again, whatever it said hit him hard enough that he let out a short, broken breath. "Please don't do that," he said, and his voice had gone thin, almost pleading. "I'll have it by Monday morning, I promise you. Just let me marry her first." The line went dead. He stood there staring at the cheap phone in his hand like it had betrayed him personally, then hurled it against the brick wall of the estate, hard enough to crack the casing. He kicked at a landscaping stone, cursed under his breath, and bent forward with his hands braced on his knees, breathing like a man who'd just finished running somewhere he hadn't wanted to go. I stood perfectly still behind the hedge line, letting what I'd just heard settle into place. This wasn't a man managing a rough quarter. This was a man who owed someone real money, real enough to send collectors to a wedding venue, real enough to make him beg for 48 hours like his life depended on the number. And one phrase kept turning over in my mind, long after he'd hung up. "Once the wedding's done, I'll have what I need." He hadn't said how, he'd just implied there, but a man doesn't say a thing like that unless he's already decided my daughter, or something attached to her, is the answer to a debt he can't cover any other way. I turned quietly and made my way back down the gravel path toward the lights and noise of the reception, leaving him alone in the dark to compose whatever was left of himself before he had to smile for a room full of people again. Somewhere behind me, the string quartet had shifted into something upbeat, and the sound of it drifted out through the garden like nothing at all had just happened, like a man hadn't just stood 40 feet away and quietly begged for his life. I walked slower than I needed to, giving myself time to think before I had to put a neutral face back on for whatever waited inside. Whatever I'd come to this dinner believing that I was here to endure a weekend of small cruelties and go home had just become something else entirely. My daughter was standing 3 days away from marrying a man who owed dangerous people money he didn't have, and who had already decided before a single vow was spoken that she was somehow the answer to his problem. I didn't yet know how. I didn't yet have proof solid enough to put in front of her. But I had enough now to know I needed it, and I intended to find it before the wedding, not after. I found her near the dessert table this time, laughing at something one of her bridesmaids had said. The tension from earlier folded away for the moment behind a genuine smile. It was the first unguarded look at her I'd caught all night, and for a second I almost turned back toward my own table and let her keep it. But the garden was still fresh in my mind, and a father who walks away from a question because the timing feels wrong is a father who ends up finding out the truth too late to do anything useful with it. I only wanted one more minute of her time. "Can I see the ring again?" I asked, keeping my voice light. Properly this time. I didn't get a good look earlier. She hesitated, surprised by the request, but held her hand out toward me, palm down, fingers slightly stiff. The stone caught the chandelier light the second it moved,
throwing off a bright, confident flash that had clearly done its job on every guest who'd admired it tonight. "Zaire had it custom set," she said, some of the old defensiveness creeping back into her voice, like she expected me to criticize it the way I'd criticized nothing all evening. "He said a woman like me deserved something that commanded a room the second she walked in." I leaned in and studied it under the light without reaching for her hand, the way a man studies something without wanting to seem like he doesn't trust his own eyes. In the early 2000s, Meridian had run a 2-year security freight contract hauling insured jewelry shipments up the East Coast for a diamond consortium out of Antwerp, and the underwriters had required a senior officer on every load to personally verify what we were carrying before it left the vault. I'd spent countless hours beside gemologists during those 2 years, learning what they watched for, the internal fire a genuine stone throws when light bends and scatters through it, the particular way real brilliance moves when you tilt it, restless and alive, never quite settling into one flat plane. The stone on my daughter's finger was large cut, with careful symmetry flawless to any eye that hadn't spent 2 years sitting in a vault. But the light coming off it was wrong. It caught and held in one place instead of scattering flat and glassy where it should have thrown color in every direction. It was bright the way a mirror is bright, not the way a diamond is bright. There was nothing moving inside it at all. "It's beautiful," I said, and meant it as gently as I could manage, because it was. It just wasn't what she'd been told it was. I straightened up and let her hand fall back to her side. She was watching my face for a reaction, the way she used to when she was small and wanted to know if she'd done something right. And I gave her nothing but a small, steady smile, because there was no version of this conversation that could happen standing in the middle of a crowded dessert table with her fiancé 40 feet away. She smoothed her dress and turned to rejoin her bridesmaids, already pulled back into the current of the evening, already reaching for her phone to show someone else the ring that had just told me more about her fiancé than 3 days of watching him ever could. I stood alone by the dessert table for a long moment, letting the sounds of the party blur into a low hum around me. I didn't move. I didn't reach for anything, didn't call anyone, didn't let my face show a single thing to the room. Somewhere behind me, a server refilled a tray of champagne flutes, and somewhere further off, a woman laughed at a joke I hadn't heard, and none of it touched me at all. A man can be handed a piece of information large enough to change everything and still, for 1 full minute, need nothing more than silence to hold it. I had built an entire career on staying steady in the half-second after bad news landed, and I made myself use every bit of that training now, standing perfectly still while the true weight of what I'd just seen settled all the way down. The stone was fake. That meant one of 2 things, and I already suspected which. Either Zaire had never had the money to buy her a real diamond in the first place, or he'd had a real one once, and it had gone somewhere else, sold or pawned or handed over to whoever had made him beg for 48 hours in a dark garden less than an hour ago. Both possibilities pointed the same direction, and neither one had anything to do with the $50 million fund he'd bragged about all night. I thought of the trust he'd mentioned on that burner phone, vague and unnamed something, he intended to have access to the moment the wedding was finalized. I thought of Aubriella's hand, still glowing with borrowed light under the chandeliers, utterly certain she was loved, the way she believed she deserved to be loved. Somewhere between those 2 thoughts sat the shape of what I was actually dealing with, and it was larger and colder than a man simply lying about his bank account to impress a room full of strangers. I would need more than instinct and a trained eye before I put any of this in front of my daughter. Aubriella had spent 2 years building a version of her life around this man, and a version that comfortable doesn't come apart because her father squinted at a piece of jewelry under a chandelier. I would need proof solid enough that she couldn't look away from it, evidence with her own name on the paperwork, if that's what it took to, and I intended to find it before the sun came up on her wedding day. I made my way back toward my table as the band wound down and a low chime rang out somewhere near the head table, the signal that the evening was moving into its toasts.
I sat folded my hands and watched Zaire rise from his seat with a wireless microphone already in hand, the kind of practiced ease that told me he'd rehearsed whatever was coming. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began, his voice smooth and carrying easily through the speakers positioned around the room. "Tomorrow I marry the most incredible woman I've ever met. But tonight, I want to talk about legacy, about what it actually takes to build something real from the ground up." He paced a slow half-circle at the front of the room, letting his eyes drift across the tables of investors and family friends, gathering the attention like a man who'd done this 100 times before, an audience that always believed him. "Some of you already know Rise Up Wealth has been chasing a major acquisition for the last several months," he continued, warming into it now, chest-lifting, with the kind of pride that only comes from a lie a man has told himself so many times he's started to believe it. "It's been a grueling process, but I'm proud to announce in front of my future bride and everyone who matters to me that we closed the deal this week." The room erupted into applause, glasses lifting, a ripple of genuine excitement moving through tables full of people who'd trusted him with money I now suspected he no longer had. Georgia clapped loudest of all from the front row, her face bright with the particular satisfaction of a woman watching her investment finally pay off. "We just secured a controlling stake in Meridian Cold Chain," Zaire announced, his chest puffed out further still. "One of the largest refrigerated logistics networks on the East Coast. It's a legacy asset and, as of this week, it's officially part of our portfolio." The applause swelled louder. I sat perfectly still in my chair by the kitchen doors and let it wash over me, saying nothing. My face giving away exactly as much as it always did, which was nothing at all. Somewhere in this room, 200 people were celebrating the acquisition of a company I had built from a single leased truck and a line of credit no one wanted to give a young black veteran in 1986. A company that had never once had a controlling stake sold to anyone, let alone a man who couldn't cover a dinner bill without his jaw going tight. I thought of the drivers who'd been with Meridian for 20 years, the dispatch team that still called me at midnight when a route went sideways, the board that answered to exactly one person, and none of it had a single thing to do with the man currently taking a bow for owning it. It would have been easy to stand up right then and end the lie in front of every investor in the room. I stayed seated. A man doesn't win a war by correcting the enemy's math in the middle of his own victory speech. He lets the enemy keep believing the math is right for as long as it takes to be certain of everything else. Zaire let the applause build a moment longer before raising his hand to quiet it, and then his eyes drifted almost lazily toward the dark corner by the kitchen doors. He found me easily. He always seemed to know exactly where I was sitting. "You know, building something real requires a certain kind of evolution," he said, his tone shifting into something slower, more deliberate, the microphone picking up every word. "It means leaving the old ways behind. I look around this room and I see the future, but I'm also reminded every now and then of the past." He paused, letting the silence stretch, and gestured toward me with the hand still holding his champagne glass. "Some men spend 40 years hauling freight in a rusted truck and call that a life's work. There's a nobility to it, I suppose, but it isn't building anything, it's just staying in motion." A few of his groomsmen laughed low and knowing, glancing back toward my table. Georgia let out a short, delighted laugh of her own, raising her glass in agreement without a flicker of hesitation. I felt the weight of 200 strangers' attention shift toward me for a moment, curious, amused, already deciding what kind of man sits quietly in the corner of his own daughter's engagement dinner. I didn't move. I picked up my water glass and took a slow, even sip, letting the cold settle exactly the way my expression did. Zaire Skinner had just stood in front of 200 witnesses and announced with complete confidence that he owned the one thing in this room that actually belonged to me. He didn't know it yet. Nobody in this room did. I set the glass down, rose from my chair without hurrying, and let my eyes find Aubriella across the room one last time before I turned toward the exit. She was clapping along with everyone else, smiling the practiced, hopeful smile of a woman trying very hard to believe the man beside her was exactly who he claimed to be.
I held that image a moment longer than I needed to, then walked out through the same door I'd used to follow Zaire into the garden not 2 hours before, already thinking about what I'd need to do next and how little time I had left to do it. I stopped just short of the door, one hand already on the frame, and let myself take one more look at the room before I stepped out into the night. The band had shifted into something slow, and couples were drifting toward the dance floor in twos, the whole room settling into that softer, later stage of a party where people stop performing for each other quite so hard. Aubriella had drifted a few steps away from the crowd, still clustered around Zaire, her phone in her hand, the light of the screen catching the underside of her face in a way that made her look younger than 27, younger than a woman 3 days from her wedding. Whatever was on that screen changed something in her expression almost instantly. Her brows drew together, her mouth tightened at the corners, and for a moment, she looked less like a bride and more like a woman reading a piece of news she didn't want to be true. She glanced up, scanning the room quickly, the same reflexive check she'd done with me on the front steps hours earlier, making sure no one important had seen whatever had just crossed her face. No one had, except me. She typed something back fast, her thumb moving with the tight urgency of a person trying to end a conversation rather than continue it. Then locked the screen and slid the phone deep into her clutch, snapping it shut, harder than the moment called for. She smoothed the front of her dress, took a slow breath I recognized because I'd taught her that same breath myself years ago, before piano recitals and job interviews, and the kind of hard news a child doesn't yet have the tools to carry, and turned back toward the party with a smile already rebuilt and back in place. I stood in the doorway a moment longer than I should have, watching her fold whatever she'd just felt back down into something small enough to carry through the rest of the evening. I remembered teaching her that trick, though I'd never called it a trick at the time. I'd called it composure, back when she was 12, and Georgia and I were sitting in separate rooms of the same house, and I'd told her that a steady face bought a person time to figure out what they actually wanted to do next. I hadn't considered until just now that I might have taught my daughter to hide things a little too well. I had no idea who the message was from or what it said. I only knew the look on her face hadn't belonged to a woman receiving good news, and that she'd chosen in less time than it takes to finish a breath not to let anyone see it. I thought of the box she'd shoved into her clutch without opening it earlier, the ring she'd defended without quite meeting my eyes, and wondered, not for the first time tonight, how much of my daughter's composure was armor she'd built for a life she wasn't entirely sure she wanted. It wasn't my place to ask, not yet, not with nothing but a stranger's whispered phone call and a fake diamond to my name. A father who pushes too early on a wound he can't yet name only teaches his daughter to hide it better the next time. And I had already done enough of that without meaning to. I let her go, watched her rejoin the edge of the crowd near the bar, laughing at something one of the groomsmen said, with a little too much brightness in it. My attention shifted instead to the opportunity standing right in front of me. Zaire was still surrounded by his own crowd, refilling glasses, thoroughly occupied for at least the next several minutes, riding the high of a room that had just applauded a lie he'd told about a company he had never come within 100 miles of owning. Earlier in the evening, while the caterers were still setting up the tents outside, I'd seen him disappear through a door near the service hallway marked Private, a small staging room where the wedding planner had told me he'd be changing out of his travel clothes before the guests arrived. A man performing this much wealth in public usually keeps whatever he actually carries with him somewhere close, somewhere private, somewhere he doesn't have to perform for. If there was a version of Zaire that existed without an audience watching, that room was as good a place as any to start looking for it. I hesitated at the mouth of the corridor, weighing what I was about to do against everything I'd been raised to believe about a man's right to his own privacy. I had spent 4 decades building a company on the principle that trust once given deserved to be honored. But I had also spent those same 4 decades learning that trust extended blindly to the wrong man was how families lost everything they'd worked for. And I no longer had the luxury of pretending Zaire Skinner had earned the benefit of the doubt. I stepped back from the garden door and turned down the narrow corridor instead, my daughter's strange, guarded expression still sitting somewhere behind my eyes. One more unanswered question, added to a night that already had far too many of them. Whatever she'd read on that screen, whatever had made her hands move that fast to hide it, I told myself I would ask her about it eventually, when there was room in the conversation for an honest answer instead of a performance for the nearest set of watching eyes. Tonight, there was somewhere else I needed to be first. The staging room sat at the end of the service hallway door, unlocked lights left burning over a folding rack that held Zaire's travel suit and an overnight bag tossed carelessly onto a chair. Nobody had thought to secure a room, nobody expected the bride's father to find. And I supposed that was the entire advantage of being underestimated for most of a lifetime. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, the noise of the party dropping to a low, distant hum through the wall, replaced by the small, deliberate sounds of my own breathing. I moved carefully, the way I'd been trained to move through spaces that weren't mine, cataloging without disturbing, leaving every object exactly where I'd found it. The overnight bag held nothing but toiletries and a spare shirt, nothing worth the risk I was taking to be standing in this room at all. The travel suit hung on the rack, and up close it told a different story than it had across a crowded room. The fabric was thinner than it should have been, the stitching along the lapel slightly uneven in the way machine-finished suits are when they're rushed off a factory line rather than cut by hand. A man who bragged about custom Italian wool didn't own a suit like this one. I checked the inside jacket pocket out of habit more than expectation, the same reflex that had kept freight manifests honest for 4 decades. And that was when a small rectangle of cardstock slipped free and fluttered to the carpet. I bent down and picked it up. It wasn't a business card or a receipt from the caterer. It was a pawn ticket, the kind printed on heavy pink stock with a shop's logo embossed faintly across the top, the ink slightly smudged from having been folded and unfolded more than once. I turned it toward the lamp on the dresser and read it carefully. The date stamped in the corner was exactly 3 months old, the same week I realized with a slow, cold recognition that Zaire had proposed. The item description ran 2 lines printed in the shop's careful, deliberate hand. 1 antique cut diamond platinum mounting approximately 3 carats removed from setting at customer's request. Beneath it, a payout figure large enough to explain, at least in part, how a man with no real income had covered an engagement dinner running well into 6 figures. I stood with the ticket in my hand and let the full shape of it settle into place. He hadn't bought Aubriella a fake ring from nothing. He'd taken a real one, an heirloom that had likely belonged to her grandmother long before either of them existed, pulled the genuine stone free from its original setting, and had a cheap substitute cut and mounted in its place, so the ring would still look to anyone who hadn't spent 2 years in a vault with gemologists, exactly like the one that had always sat in whatever box her family kept it in. He'd sold the truth and handed my daughter a convincing enough lie to wear on her hand for the rest of her life if I hadn't been the one to look closely enough to notice. I thought about the effort that took. Extracting a stone from an antique setting without damaging the mounting required a jeweler willing to do quiet, careful, off-book work, the kind you don't find without knowing exactly who to ask. This wasn't a man panicking in the moment. This was a man who had planned the deception with the same patience he'd used to plan everything else about the version of himself he'd shown my daughter for 2 years. The setting made sense of something else, too. A man desperate enough to gut a family heirloom for cash 3 months before his wedding wasn't managing a temporary rough patch. He was drowning, and had been drowning for longer than 1 bad week of bounced transfers. Whatever he owed whoever was collecting it, this ticket meant the debt went back further than the burner phone conversation in the garden, further than tonight, further than anything I'd assumed I was dealing with an hour ago. I folded the ticket carefully along its original crease and slid it into my breast pocket, next to nothing else, yet, though I understood already that it wouldn't stay alone there for long. A single pawn ticket, however damning, was still just a piece of paper a clever man could explain away in front of a daughter who wanted badly to believe him. I needed more than 1 thread, I needed enough that Aubriella couldn't look at the evidence and decide her father had simply misunderstood, or worse, decide her father had gone looking for a reason to ruin her happiness because he'd never approved of the life she was building without him in it. I glanced once more around the small room, searching for anything else that might have been left carelessly behind, some second thread I could pull before I ran out of time. Nothing else presented itself. The room held exactly one secret, and I already had it folded against my chest. That was when I heard it. Footsteps in the hallway, unhurried, but headed directly toward the door I'd closed behind me, and a voice I recognized immediately, already halfway through a sentence to someone walking beside him. There was no time left to decide whether I'd found enough. There was only time left to decide what I'd do in the next 10 seconds, standing in a room I had no right to be standing in, holding proof of exactly the kind of man my daughter was about to marry. The door swung open before I decided what to do with the 10 seconds I had left. Zaire stepped through mid-sentence, phone in hand, and stopped dead when he saw me standing in the middle of his private room instead of somewhere on the other side of the hall. "What the hell are you doing in here?" His voice dropped low and hard, all the polish gone in an instant. He pocketed the phone and closed the distance between us fast, close enough that I caught the whiskey on his breath. "This is a private room." "I got turned around looking for the men's room," I said, keeping my voice level, my hands loose at my sides. "Bullshit." He looked past me at the open garment bag, at the jacket I'd left hanging slightly askew on the rack, and something shifted behind his eyes as he did the math. "You went through my things." I didn't answer that, and my silence told him everything he needed to know. He grabbed the front of my jacket with both hands and shoved me backward, hard enough that I hit the edge of the dresser and felt the wood bite into my lower back. I didn't raise my hands. I didn't move to break his grip. I stood there and let him do it the same way I'd let a room full of strangers laugh at me over expensive champagne earlier tonight. Because a man swinging wild at a target that refuses to fall usually tires himself out faster than one who fights back. Something about the shove reached further back than tonight. I was 9 years old the last time a man's hands had moved me like that, with the same casual certainty that I had no standing to object, a loan officer in a starched shirt steering my father bodily out of a bank lobby while a line of customers watched and said nothing. My father hadn't fought back either. I hadn't understood it then, watching from the sidewalk, with my mother's hand tight around mine. I understood it perfectly now, standing in a stranger's borrowed room 40 years later. Some men learn early that stillness costs less than the alternative, and the lesson never quite stops paying rent. "You have no idea what you just walked into," he hissed close enough now that I could see the fine tremor working through his jaw. "You think you can poke around in my life and it doesn't cost you anything? I will end you, old man. I will make sure you never see your daughter again, never set foot near her, never get invited to another holiday for the rest of your miserable life. You keep whatever you think you found to yourself, or I promise you, tomorrow's wedding will be the last time you ever stand in the same room as Aubriella." I let the threat land and said nothing in return. There was a version of this moment where I grabbed him by the collar and put him on the floor without much effort at all, 4 decades of physical labor still living in my hands, whether he could see it in my posture or not. I didn't move toward that version. A man doesn't win by proving his strength to someone too frightened to notice it was already obvious. He shoved me once more for good measure, a smaller push this time, more performance than force, and stepped back, straightening his jacket with hands that weren't quite steady. "Stay out of my business," he said, quieter now, like the anger had already burned through whatever fuel it had. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." He turned and walked out without waiting for a response, leaving the door open behind him, his footsteps fading fast down the corridor, back toward the noise of the party. He hadn't asked what I'd found. That told me something too. A man with nothing to hide asks exactly what you saw. A man with everything to hide is too afraid of the answer to ask the question. I stood alone in the small room for a long moment, my back still aching where the dresser had caught me, and let myself feel just briefly exactly how much that shove had cost me before I put it away where it belonged. It wasn't the pain. I'd carried worse. It was the particular old feeling of being physically moved by a man who believed I had no right to stand where I was standing, a feeling I hadn't touched in decades and had no interest in examining any closer than I had to tonight. I reached into my jacket, pulled out my phone, and dialed a number I knew by heart. Joshua Weiss had handled Meridian's legal and financial affairs for close to 15 years, quiet, precise, and entirely unbothered by whatever hour a call came in. He answered on the second ring, already alert.
"I need everything you can find on Zaire Skinner," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the ache still spreading across my lower back. "Financial history, business filings, court records, anything with his name attached to a debt. Start tonight. I don't have until Monday."
"Give me until morning," Joshua said. No hesitation in his voice, no questions about why a man was calling him after midnight, the weekend before my own daughter's wedding. That was exactly why I'd kept him close all these years. "I'll have something on your desk before you're awake." I ended the call and stood in the empty room a moment longer. The pawn ticket still folded against my chest, already turning over what I'd need to find next and what I'd need to become before I found it. I sat in the cab of my truck in the motel parking lot, engine off, the dashboard clock reading past 1 in the morning. I'd left the reception an hour earlier, quietly, without saying goodbye to anyone who would have noticed either way. The lot was empty except for a flickering street lamp and the low hum of the highway somewhere beyond the tree line. My phone buzzed against the passenger seat before I'd even had the chance to close my eyes. "Tell me you found something," I said, answering on the first ring. "I found several things," Joshua said, and something in the careful, measured way he said it told me to brace for more than a bad credit report. "None of them are good, and one of them is going to change how you're thinking about this weekend entirely. Start with the money." Rise Up Wealth has almost no legitimate revenue. What little capital it raised from early investors got funneled into a personal cryptocurrency trading account under Zaire's name 18 months ago. That account lost most of its value in a single crash back in the spring. He's been running the company on fumes and borrowed time ever since. "That fits with something I overheard at the party tonight," I said. "A transfer bounced twice this week. His people were trying to keep it quiet." "That would track. He's been juggling operating accounts to keep the appearance of solvency going long enough to reach the wedding, from what I can tell. It also explains a rather large loan he took out 3 weeks ago from a lending platform that operates almost entirely offshore, the kind that doesn't ask many questions, as long as the collateral checks out." "What collateral does a man with no money put up for a loan like that?" Joshua paused, and I could hear him choosing the next words carefully. "That's the part you need to sit with Alden. I pulled the filing. The loan is secured against a co-trustee position on a retirement fund. Ruby Stone Baptist Church's pension fund specifically. The paperwork lists Aubriella Paul as the newly appointed co-trustee, effective 3 weeks ago, with signing authority over fund transfers above a certain threshold." I sat perfectly still, the phone pressed hard against my ear. "Aubriella isn't on the church finance committee. She's never been near that fund in her life." "I know. I pulled 3 samples of her signature from old Meridian paperwork to compare. The signature on the trustee appointment doesn't match, not a close forgery either. Whoever signed it wasn't trying particularly hard to get her handwriting right, which tells me they were confident nobody was going to check closely enough to notice before the wedding made the whole arrangement look legitimate on paper." I didn't say anything for a long moment. Outside the windshield, the street lamp flickered once and steadied, throwing long shadows across the empty lot. "He used her name," I finally said, "to secure a debt against a pension fund that isn't even hers." "That's what the filing shows. If the loan defaults, the lender has legal grounds to pursue the collateral, which means pursuing the fund itself. I don't know yet how much exposure that creates for the church, but given the loan amount, it isn't small." I closed my eyes and let the full weight of it settle over me. This had stopped somewhere in the last 30 seconds being a story about my daughter and a man who'd lied to her. Ruby Stone was the church I'd sat in every Sunday for 20 years, The church whose roof I'd quietly funded 3 separate times without ever putting my name on the check. The church where half the congregation had watched Aubriella grow up in the pews. Every one of those retired deacons and choir members whose pensions sat in that fund had trusted an institution to protect what little they'd managed to save across a lifetime of work. And Zaire had reached in and used my own daughter's stolen signature to gamble with it. I sat with the phone still pressed to my ear and said nothing at all for what must have been close to a full minute. Joshua didn't fill the silence. He'd worked for me long enough to know when a man needed the quiet more than he needed an answer. "Sir," he finally said, "what do you want me to do?" "Keep digging," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I need to know exactly how deep this goes, and I need to know it before the sun comes up. This isn't just about protecting my daughter anymore, Joshua. There's a whole congregation standing behind her that has no idea what's about to happen to them." "Understood," Joshua said. "I'll have a fuller picture by sunrise. You should try to sleep if you can." I told him I would, though we both knew it wasn't true, and ended the call. I sat alone in the dark cab of my truck for a long while, the pawn ticket and now this new, far heavier fact sitting together against my chest. I thought about Deacon Marsh, 81 years old, who'd sat 2 pews behind me every Sunday since before Aubriella was born and lived entirely off what that fund paid him each month. I thought about the choir director's widow and the retired school teacher who ran the food pantry and every other quiet, faithful name I could put to that congregation, none of whom had the first idea their savings were sitting on the wrong side of a stranger's gambling debt. This was no longer a story I could resolve with a private conversation and a canceled wedding. Whatever came next was going to require the full weight of everything I'd spent 4 decades building, and I understood finally and completely exactly what I was going to have to become before this weekend was over. I didn't start the engine right away. I sat in the dark, hands resting on the wheel, and let myself feel the particular exhaustion that comes not from a long day, but from a long day that has just revealed itself to be far longer than I'd understood. My phone screen had gone dark in the cup holder. The parking lot lamp buzzed faintly overhead, the only sound besides my own breathing. My first instinct, the one I had to sit with and let pass before I could think clearly, was to call Aubriella right then, wake her if I had to, and tell her everything. Lay the pawn ticket and the forged signature and the collapsed cryptocurrency account out in front of her before she had another chance to defend a man who had already decided her name was worth more to him as collateral than she was worth to him as a person. Some part of me wanted badly to simply be her father, in the plainest sense of the word, and let the truth do whatever damage it needed to do tonight instead of tomorrow. I didn't reach for the phone. I thought of my own father instead, the way I usually did when a decision like this one settled onto my chest. He'd owned a small auto repair shop in a part of town the banks had quietly decided wasn't worth investing in. And when the loan officer called the note due early, on a technicality nobody could quite explain, my father hadn't fought publicly. He'd gone to that bank alone in his good shirt and tried to reason with men who had already made up their minds about him before he walked through the door. I remembered standing on the sidewalk outside with my mother 9 years old, watching him get steered back out onto the street by a man half his age, and I remembered how quiet he was in the truck on the drive home, how he never once raised his voice about it in front of me again. He absorbed it. He carried it privately the way he carried everything, and some deep, wordless part of me had decided, watching him do that a man protects what's his by controlling exactly what the world gets to see of it. I understood sitting in my own truck 40 years later that I had built an entire life on that same lesson. I hid what I had so no one could use it against me. I managed problems quietly from a distance rather than standing in a room and simply telling the people I loved the truth while it still had the power to help them. It had made me exceptional at building an empire. I wasn't entirely certain sitting here now that it had made me a particularly good father. Aubriella had grown up watching a man who solved everything from behind a closed door, and I had never once stopped to consider that she might have learned from watching me exactly the same lesson about which parts of herself were safe to show a room. There was a version of tonight where I called her anyway consequences and strategy be damned, because a daughter deserves the truth from her father more than she deserves his careful timing. I turned that version over for a long moment, genuinely weighing it before I set it back down. Telling Aubriella everything tonight, with nothing yet in hand but a pawn ticket and a phone call from my attorney, would hand Zaire exactly what he needed: a devastated, defensive daughter he could talk back down before morning, and a father he could paint as bitter and vindictive for trying to sabotage her happiness the night before her wedding. He was skilled enough with words to survive an accusation. He wasn't skilled enough to survive a debt he could no longer pay to a man who now owned it outright. I needed leverage large enough that no amount of his charm could argue its way around it. I needed the debt itself, not just the knowledge of it, and I needed it before I said a single word to my daughter. I thought too of the mahogany box still sitting on a cocktail table somewhere in that reception hall, ringed with condensation, holding nothing yet because Aubriella hadn't had a place safe enough to put anything into it. I had built that box out of wood I couldn't bring myself to explain to her. Perhaps silence had simply become the material I built everything from, whether I meant it to or not. I picked up the phone and called Joshua back. "I want you to acquire Zaire's legitimate debt," I said before he'd even finished saying hello. "Every loan, every outstanding note, anything with his signature on it that a bank or a lender would be willing to sell. Start with whatever's public record first thing this morning and keep going until there's nothing left standing between him and me." "That's a considerable undertaking before a wedding," Joshua said, not questioning it, simply noting the scale. "I'm aware," I said. "Get it done anyway." "I'll have movement by mid-morning," Joshua said. "Some of this will need to route through the blind trust to keep your name off the paperwork until you're ready to use it." "Do whatever keeps it clean," I said. "Just do it fast." I ended the call, started the engine, and pulled out of the empty lot into the last dark hour before morning, already several steps ahead of a man who had no idea yet exactly whose family he had chosen to gamble against, and no idea yet how quietly the ground beneath him was already beginning to shift. I'd slept perhaps 2 hours before the sun came up over the motel parking lot, and I spent most of that time lying awake rather than resting, running through what I needed to do before the ceremony that evening. By 7, I was showered and dressed, and by 7:30, I was pulling into the small gravel lot behind Ruby Stone Baptist Church, the building still quiet in the early light, the sanctuary doors not yet unlocked for the day. I found Noel Barton in his office at the back of the fellowship hall, exactly where he always was this early, a cup of black coffee steaming beside a stack of sermon notes he'd likely rewritten 3 times already. The office hadn't changed much in the 2 decades I'd known him. The same worn Bible on the corner of the desk, the same framed photograph of the congregation from the year they'd broken ground on the new fellowship hall, my own younger face, somewhere in the 3rd row of that picture before Georgia and I had separated, before Aubriella had grown into a woman I sometimes struggled to recognize. He looked up when I knocked on the open doorframe, and whatever showed on my face must have told him this wasn't a social visit, because he set his pen down immediately and gestured me toward the chair across from his desk. "Alden, I didn't expect to see you before this afternoon." He studied me a moment longer. "You look like a man who hasn't slept." "I haven't," I admitted, taking the seat. "I need to talk to you about the pension fund." His expression shifted the easy warmth, giving way to something more careful. Noel had known me for 20 years. Had officiated my mother's funeral and blessed the ground when we broke it for the new fellowship hall, and he'd learned somewhere along the way that I didn't raise a subject like this one without cause. "I've become concerned about some recent paperwork attached to the fund," I said, choosing each word with the same care I'd use closing a contract I didn't fully trust. "I can't tell you everything yet, Noel. I need you to trust me on that for now. But I'd ask you to freeze any transfers above the standard monthly disbursements until I can bring you something more concrete. No exceptions, no matter who requests it or how urgent it seems, no matter how legitimate the paperwork looks on its face." He didn't ask me why the paperwork might look legitimate and still be worth stopping. That was, I thought, exactly the kind of discernment that had kept this congregation's finances sound through 2 recessions in the first place. Noel was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup slowly on the desk. This concerns the appointment we approved a few weeks back, doesn't it? The co-trustee edition. I hadn't expected him to connect it that quickly, though I supposed I shouldn't have been surprised. Noel had run this congregation's finances through 2 recessions and a building campaign without losing a dollar he couldn't account for. It might, I said, giving him as much truth as I could afford without unraveling everything before I had proof solid enough to act on. I'm asking you to trust me a little longer before I explain the rest. You've never once asked me to trust you blindly in 20 years, Alden. He reached for a folder in his desk drawer, made a note, and set it aside. Consider it done. I'll speak to the finance committee this afternoon. Frame it as a routine audit. No transfers go out until you tell me otherwise. Thank you, I said, and meant it more than the 2 words could carry. He didn't let me stand up right away. He studied me a moment longer, the same patient-searching look he used from the pulpit when he already knew the answer to a question and was simply waiting for the room to catch up to him. It was the look he'd given me the year my marriage ended, when I'd sat in this same chair insisting I was fine, and he'd simply waited until I stopped insisting. Can I ask you something, Alden, man to man, before you go? Of course. Are you doing this for Aubriella? He said quietly. Or are you doing it for all of us? I sat with the question longer than I meant to, longer than was comfortable in the silence of that small office. Part of me wanted to say Aubriella, cleanly and simply, because that was the truest thing I could offer him without unraveling the rest of it. But another part of me, the part that had spent the whole drive over thinking about Deacon Marsh and the choir director's widow and every quiet, faithful name I could put to this congregation, knew that answer wouldn't be the whole truth either. Not anymore. Somewhere between the pawn ticket and Joshua's call at 1 in the morning, the 2 reasons had folded into each other until I could no longer say with any certainty where protecting my daughter ended and protecting this church began. I wasn't entirely certain, if I was honest with myself, that I knew the whole truth of my own answer. I need to go, I said instead, rising from the chair. I'll come back to you with everything, Noel. I promise you that. He nodded, slowly accepting the answer I hadn't quite given him, and I left the church with his question still sitting somewhere behind my ribs unresolved, following me out into the gathering heat of the morning. I'd made it halfway across the gravel lot toward my truck when I heard footsteps hurrying behind me and a woman's voice calling my name. I turned to find Renata Foster, who chaired the church's finance committee, crossing the lot with a folder clutched against her chest, and Noel a few steps behind her, his face tight with something that hadn't been there 5 minutes earlier. Alden, wait! Renata caught up slightly out of breath. Pastor Noel just told me what you asked him to freeze. I need you both to see something before you leave. I was already in the office this morning pulling the quarterly disbursement report, and I found something I don't understand. We went back inside into Noel's office, and Renata spread 3 printed pages across the desk between us, her hands not quite steady as she arranged them. These are wire transfer authorizations, she said, pointing to a column of names and dates, from individual retirement accounts within the pension fund. 4 of them over the last 2 months, each one following a financial literacy seminar Zaire held here in the fellowship hall. He called it an educational session on generational wealth building. Flyers went up in the vestibule, refreshments, a slideshow with charts. I sat in the back of one myself. It seemed harmless at the time, even generous of him, a young man giving up his Saturday to help older folks understand their retirement options. I scanned the names on the page, and for a moment, the words simply sat there as data, the way any unfamiliar column of figures sits on a page before it means anything. Then I found the 3rd name down, and the data stopped being data. Odessa Freeman, 83 years old, a woman who had taught Sunday school to 3 generations of this congregation, including, 20-some years ago, a much younger Aubriella who still kept a hand-stitched sampler Odessa had made her, hanging somewhere in her apartment. I remembered Odessa from 100 Sunday mornings, her voice leading the second row in hymns long after her hearing had started to go. refusing every offer anyone made to help her walk to her car unassisted. Odessa had wired $11,000 of her retirement distribution directly into an account associated with Rise Up Wealth 6 weeks earlier, following a seminar where a smooth, well-dressed young man had promised her a guaranteed return that would let her finally stop worrying about her granddaughter's tuition. I sat with her name in front of me and said nothing for a long moment. Noelle didn't fill the silence, and neither did Renata. Both of them watching me the way people watch a man they can tell has just found something he wasn't prepared for, even standing in a room he'd walked into already braced for bad news. "This isn't a risk anymore," I finally said, my voice quieter than I meant it to come out. "This already happened." "4 families that we know of so far," Renata said. "I haven't finished the full audit. There could be more. I only pulled the accounts flagged for unusual activity this morning, before you even called Noelle. I had no idea what I was walking into when I started." "What are the other 3 amounts?" I asked. She checked the page. 6,000, 4,500, and a little over 15,000 from a couple who I believe are still making payments on a mortgage. She looked up at me. "Nearly $37,000 total across 4 families, none of whom have any idea their money didn't go where they were told it was going." Noel closed his eyes briefly, one hand pressed flat against the desk, as if he needed something solid to hold on to. "Odessa," he said almost to himself. "She asked me last month whether I thought the market was a safe place for an old woman to put her savings. I told her to talk to a financial advisor she trusted." He looked up at me, and the warmth I'd known in his face for 20 years had gone hard and cold. I didn't know he was the advisor she meant. I thought of every version of the day I'd been quietly building toward, every plan that had assumed I had until the wedding that evening to finish gathering proof before I moved. That plan had been built for a threat that hadn't happened yet. Something still theoretical enough to handle with patience and careful timing. This was no longer that. Real people, people I'd known most of my adult life, people who had sat 2 pews behind me every Sunday for 2 decades, had already handed their savings to a man who was using my own daughter's stolen signature to cover a debt he had no intention of ever repaying honestly. Patience was a luxury that belonged to yesterday's version of this problem, and I no longer had the right to spend it. "I need everything you have on the other 3 families by this afternoon," I said, rising from the chair, the earlier calculation about timing and leverage falling away in favor of something far more immediate. "And, Noelle, whatever version of me you were asking about this morning, I think we've moved past the point where the answer matters. I'm doing this for all of it now, every part of it." I left the church for the 2nd time that morning, moving faster than I had the first. Odessa Freeman's name sitting where the pawn ticket had been sitting all night, one more weight added to a debt Zaire Skinner was about to discover he could no longer outrun. By the time I pulled into the service entrance of the estate grounds, the morning had already burned off into a hard, bright heat, and the property had transformed overnight into something closer to a small production set than a home. Florists were unloading buckets of white roses from a refrigerated van. Caterers shouted instructions to each other across a row of half-assembled tents, and somewhere near the main house, a string of paper lanterns was still being hung along the garden path, swaying gently in a breeze that carried none of the coolness its appearance promised. I parked near the loading dock out of the way and stepped down from the cab, still carrying the weight of everything I'd learned that morning. Odessa Freeman's name sitting somewhere behind my ribs alongside the pawn ticket and every other piece of proof I'd gathered since last night. I hadn't been standing near the service doors for more than 10 minutes when Georgia found me marching across the lawn with a clipboard in one hand and a wireless earpiece clipped to the other ear, barking instructions to someone I couldn't see. She spotted me and redirected her energy immediately, the way she always did, toward whatever target required the least effort to criticize. "Alden, you're standing there like a lost dog." She snapped the words out without breaking stride, ending her call mid-sentence. The ice delivery just arrived at the back gate. The catering company wants $200 to unload 50 bags, and we are not paying extra for basic labor when we're already spending a fortune on this venue. Go make yourself useful for once."
I didn't argue. I didn't remind her that a man who controls freight routes across 3 states doesn't typically need to unload a delivery truck to save $200. I simply nodded the way I'd nodded through most of this weekend and walked toward the gravel loading area at the rear of the property, understanding that Georgia and Zaire needed to keep believing right up until the moment it stopped mattering that their contempt for me carried any weight at all. Georgia had spent 30 years believing that money was the only currency capable of moving me, and there was a strange, quiet mercy in letting her keep believing that for a few more hours, right up until it would cost her everything to have believed it at all. The refrigerated truck sat idling near the back gate, its rear doors thrown open on pallets of commercial ice, each bag close to 40 pounds. I rolled up my sleeves, reached into the cold truck bed, and hoisted the first bag onto my shoulder, the chill soaking through my shirt almost instantly. I started the long walk across the property toward the reception tents, falling into the same steady rhythm I'd learned decades earlier hauling crates on the Norfolk docks during long stretches between drills back before any of this. The trucks, the contracts, the company that bore my name on every filing cabinet in 3 states had existed at all. My phone had already buzzed twice against my leg on the walk from the truck to the tents. Short vibrations I recognized as Joshua's automated updates working through the night's instructions, each one a small, silent counterweight to whatever indignity waited for me next. I didn't check either message yet. There would be time for that once my hands were free. I was carrying the 4th bag across the courtyard when a burst of laughter rolled down from the stone balcony above me. Zaire had emerged onto it with 4 of his groomsmen, all of them dressed in matching tailored suits, morning mimosas already sweating in their hands despite the early hour. He leaned over the railing, spotted me below, and pointed with theatrical delight. "Look at this," he called down, loud enough to carry across the entire courtyard. "We've got our very own pack mule for the weekend, gentlemen. Try to keep up, old man. That champagne isn't going to chill itself." One of the groomsmen, a tall man with slick-back hair, raised his glass toward me in a mocking toast. "Better hurry," he shouted, "before you break a hip." A third man laughed so hard he nearly spilled his drink over the railing, and none of them seemed to notice or care that their voices carried clearly enough for half the arriving catering staff to hear as well. I didn't break stride. I didn't look up. I kept my head down and my shoulders steady, letting the cold water run down the back of my neck and soak into my collar, playing the broken, defeated father exactly as well as I'd played every other role this weekend had required of me so far. I carried the 5th bag, then the 10th, my arms beginning to ache in the familiar way they used to ache at the end of a long shift on those Norfolk docks. A soreness I had almost missed without realizing it. Proof that a body could still be useful for something beyond signing contracts and sitting in boardrooms. Somewhere around the 15th bag, I let myself consider what Zaire and his groomsmen would say if they knew that the truck they were mocking me for unloading belonged to a company whose annual freight volume alone could have covered the entire cost of this wedding 100 times over without denting a quarterly report. Whatever they believed they were watching from that balcony, it had almost nothing left to do with who I actually was and considerably less time left to keep believing it than any of them currently understood. I carried the 20th bag across the courtyard, my shirt soaked through with equal parts sweat and melted ice, and let myself finally check the phone during the short walk back to the truck. The morning had turned the gravel path into something closer to a griddle heat, rising visibly off the stones, and I was grateful briefly for the cold still radiating off the bag on my shoulder. 2 messages waited from Joshua, terse and precise, the way he always wrote when there was too much ground to cover for full sentences. Legitimate debt acquisition complete. 3 notes purchased through blind trust total $1.2 million, all now held under Meridian's shell entity, Zaire unaware. The second message had come in only minutes behind the first. 2 of his 3 operating accounts frozen, pending review per the fraud flag filed this morning. 3rd account pending. I slid the phone back into my pocket and returned to the delivery truck for another bag.
letting the information settle into place the way I let any operational update settle before deciding what it changed. It changed a great deal. Zaire had built his entire fragile empire believing time was still on his side, believing he had until this evening's ceremony to finish gambling with money that wasn't his. He had no idea the ground beneath that empire had already started shifting hours before he'd woken up this morning. A third message followed close behind the second, this one from Joshua directly, rather than the automated feed. Also began quiet process to recover the 4 congregation transfers Renata flagged. We'll need Zaire's cooperation or a court order, but the frozen accounts give us leverage either way. Odessa Freeman and the others may get their money back before this is over. I let that one sit longer than the others. Whatever satisfaction I was allowed to take in watching Zaire's finances collapse, one silent notification at a time, the number that actually mattered to me was the one printed beside Odessa's name on Renata's spreadsheet, and the possibility, however uncertain, that it might yet find its way home. I hoisted the 25th bag onto my shoulder just as another burst of laughter rolled down from the balcony, Zaire holding court for a fresh round of mimosas, entirely unaware that 2 of his 3 bank accounts no longer answered to him. The phone buzzed again in my pocket before I'd made it halfway across the lawn. Filled fraud notification with state financial regulators re Rise Up Wealth's unregistered investment activity. Investigation opened. 30 bags in my shoulders had gone past aching into a steady, familiar numbness, the kind of physical exhaustion that used to mean the end of a long shift on the Norfolk docks, and now simply meant I had work left to finish. Zaire leaned over the railing again, calling something down about my pace that I didn't bother to fully register his voice, already smaller in my ears than it had been an hour earlier. A man shouting insults from a stage that was quietly being dismantled beneath him while he performed. One of the groomsmen tossed an ice cube down toward me, laughing when it shattered harmlessly against the gravel a few feet from my boots, and I simply stepped around it and kept walking, saving whatever reaction I had left for a moment that would actually cost him something. I set the 40th bag into the cooler with the others and paused, wiping the sweat from my forehead with the back of my wrist when the final message came through, longer than the others, and I read it, standing perfectly still in the middle of the courtyard. Offshore lending platform confirmed as sole holder of the $4 million marker against Zaire Skinner. Negotiated buyout complete via secondary shell entity paid in full this morning. You now hold the debt outright. Full documentation ready for your review whenever you need it. I stood with the phone in my hand for a long moment, the noise of the party fading into something distant and unimportant. $4 million. The exact figure that had made a grown man beg into a burner phone in a dark garden less than 18 hours ago, now belonged entirely to me. Zaire Skinner no longer owed a faceless offshore lender anything at all. He owed me. And he had no idea yet that the debt had changed hands, or that the man holding it was currently standing 40 feet below his balcony carrying bags of ice, like the pack mule he'd been so delighted to call me. Somewhere in the last 12 hours, without ever raising my voice or losing my composure once, I had become the single most important creditor in Zaire Skinner's entire fabricated life. And he had laughed at me twice this morning, without the faintest idea what that fact meant for the rest of his. I picked up the last bag, carried it the rest of the way to the cooler, and straightened my aching back, finally allowing myself just for a moment to feel the full weight of exactly how thoroughly the ground had shifted since I'd woken up this morning. 12 hours ago, I'd been a man with a suspicion and a fake diamond. Now I held his legitimate debts, 2 of his 3 bank accounts, an open regulatory investigation, and the single largest marker he owed anyone in the world. All he still held was a room full of people who believed the version of him he'd built for them, and a wedding scheduled to begin in a matter of hours. Whatever Zaire believed he was walking into tonight, the wedding he'd built his entire fragile survival plan around, he was walking into it as a man who had already lost, and simply hadn't been told yet.
I'd showered at the motel, changed back into a fresh version of the same simple suit, and returned to the estate a little past 4 in the afternoon. The ceremony itself still hours away, but the property already buzzing with the tighter, more urgent energy of a wedding closing in on its final countdown. I avoided the main lawn where guests had begun arriving in small clusters, and made my way instead down the narrow service alley that ran behind the kitchen tents, exactly where Joshua had told me to wait. A black sedan pulled up to the edge of the service gate almost precisely on time. The man who stepped out wore a dark suit and sunglasses, despite the fading afternoon light, moving with the compact, efficient economy of someone who did this kind of work often enough that it no longer required thought. He crossed to me without a word, reached inside his jacket and produced a thick leather folder stamped with a small silver crest, the same discreet mark that appeared on every document leaving Meridian's most sensitive legal channel. He handed it over, gave a single nod, and returned to the car without another sound. I watched the sedan pull away and disappear down the coastal road before I let myself breathe. I leaned back against the cool brick wall of the service kitchen and broke the folder's wax seal. Inside sat the complete file Joshua had promised, considerably more than I'd expected from a single morning's work. Thick enough that I understood immediately how many hours his team must have spent assembling it, since the sun came up. I flipped past the loan documents and account freezes I already understood and found the section I hadn't seen yet, the one Joshua's message had only hinted at. It was a full accounting of the co-trustee scheme laid out in the flat clinical language of a forensic financial report. Zaire hadn't simply forged Aubriella's signature once and hoped no one noticed. He'd built an entire paper trail designed to survive scrutiny. Backdated meeting minutes, a fabricated email chain establishing her supposed interest in church finance, even a notarized signature page where the notary's own credentials turned out to be expired the week of signing. The lending platform's collateral agreement referenced all of it cross-indexed and airtight enough that any court reviewing the file after the fact would need real effort to unwind it. This wasn't a man who'd panicked and grabbed for the nearest lie. This was architecture built over weeks by someone who understood exactly what he was constructing and exactly whose name he was building it on top of. I thought back to the seminar Renata had described, the flyers in the vestibule, the slideshow with charts, a young man giving up his Saturday to help older folks understand their retirement options. None of it had been generous. Every piece of it, going back weeks before I'd even known his name, had been construction material for exactly the structure I now held in my hands. The final page listed the 4 congregation families Renata had already flagged their transfer amounts confirmed against the same account structure, along with language I read twice to be certain I understood it correctly. The collateral agreement's terms activated fully and irrevocably the moment Aubriella's marriage to Zaire was legally finalized. Not tomorrow. Not next week. The instant a county clerk recorded their marriage certificate, whatever legal ambiguity currently existed around a forged trustee appointment would resolve itself entirely in Zaire's favor, because a married man gained certain legal standing to act on behalf of assets connected to his spouse that an engaged one simply doesn't have. I stood perfectly still in the alley, the folder heavy in my hands, and understood with sudden, total clarity that I had been operating on a timeline that no longer existed. I had planned to gather everything, confront him quietly after the ceremony, protect Aubriella from a public spectacle she hadn't asked for, hand her the truth in private where she could absorb it without 200 witnesses watching her face fall apart. That plan had assumed I had room to choose my moment. I didn't. The moment Aubriella said her vows tonight, every fragile legal barrier currently standing between Zaire and that pension fund would collapse, and no amount of frozen accounts or purchased debt would matter fast enough to stop what happened next. All the leverage in the world meant nothing against a clock that had just started actively running. I closed the folder and pressed my back harder against the brick, taking one long deliberate breath in the narrow shadow of the alley before I let myself move again. Whatever version of tonight I'd been quietly building toward for the last 18 hours, patient and controlled and perfectly timed, was no longer the version I could afford to have. I needed to act tonight, inside the ceremony itself if it came to that, before a single vow was spoken that I couldn't undo. I stepped out of the alley and back into the last hour of daylight, the folder tucked against my chest like something that had teeth. Guests in pale summer colors were already drifting toward rows of white folding chairs, arranged beneath a floral arch, the string quartet tuning quietly in the shade of an old oak tree. Everything arranged with the same careful, expensive precision Zaire had brought to every other lie he'd told this weekend. I walked toward the front of the estate, where the first guests were already taking their seats, no longer the patient investigator I'd been since last night, but a man who understood he might have to end this in the middle of the very ceremony he was about to watch. The ceremony itself passed in a blur I barely registered, standing in the back row of white folding chairs, while my daughter walked down an aisle lined with orchids to marry a man I now knew with total certainty intended to destroy everything he touched. She looked luminous. She had no idea what she was standing inside of. I said nothing, signed nothing, did nothing to stop the vows from being spoken, because I had run the numbers a dozen times in the alley and understood that stopping a wedding mid-ceremony would hand Zaire exactly the sympathy narrative he needed to survive whatever came next. I needed the marriage finalized on paper and the truth revealed in the same breath, so there would be no room left for him to spin either one. The reception moved into its second hour under a massive white tent strung with crystal chandeliers, waiters circulating with champagne, the string quartet giving way eventually to a full band. I sat at my assigned table near the kitchen entrance, exactly where I'd been placed since the first night of this weekend, the folder of evidence resting inside my jacket against my chest like a second heartbeat. I watched Zaire work the room with the easy, practiced confidence of a man who believed he had just secured everything he needed. He didn't know yet what I was holding. He didn't know 2 of his 3 accounts no longer answered to him, or that his largest debt belonged to the man sitting quietly in the shadows he'd assigned me to since the moment we met. Aubriella found me once, during the first hour, still glowing, still radiant, in a way that made the whole evening feel almost unbearable to sit through. She squeezed my hand and told me she was glad I'd come, and I told her honestly that I wouldn't have missed it, and neither of us said anything about the wooden box or the ring or any of the small fractures that had opened between us this weekend. There would be time for that conversation. I understood even then that it was likely to arrive sooner than either of us wanted. The clinking of a spoon against crystal drew the room's attention toward the front, where Zaire had climbed onto the small stage with a wireless microphone in one hand and the glass of champagne in the other. The band fell silent. 200 guests turned their chairs to face him. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice smooth and carrying easily through the tense speakers. "Today I married the most incredible woman I've ever met. But I want to take a moment before we get back to celebrating to talk about something that matters to me. Gratitude." He let the words sit, scanning the room, with the theatrical patience of a man who knew exactly how to hold an audience. Because not everyone in this room has had the same journey to get here. I felt it before I understood it, the particular shift in a room when a performer decides his final act needs a target. His eyes found me in the shadows near the kitchen doors, exactly where they always seemed to find me. "Some of you know my new father-in-law has had a difficult few decades." Zaire continued his tone, dropping into something slower, more deliberate. "Hauling freight, working with his hands, doing what he had to do to get by. There's a certain nobility in that, I think, and I don't want anyone to walk away tonight thinking I don't respect a man who's had it hard." A few scattered, uncertain laughs rippled through the tent. He signaled to a waiter standing near the cake table, and the man wheeled over a small dessert cart holding what remained of the ceremonial cake already cut for the guests. Zaire reached down to tore off a large, sloppy handful and stepped down off the stage microphone, still raised, walking directly toward my table with the easy, confident stride of a man performing the final joke of a set he'd been building all weekend. He stopped in front of me. The whole tent had gone quiet, waiting. "Eat up, deacon," he said into the microphone,
close enough now that I could smell the champagne on his breath, and shoved the fistful of cake hard into my face, frosting and crumbs sliding down into my collar, blinding me for a full second before I could blink it clear. "We don't want people saying I let my broke father-in-law starve." The laughter that followed came in a single ugly wave from a cluster of his groomsmen near the front, quickly dying when they realized most of the tent hadn't joined them. I sat perfectly still, the frosting cooling against my skin, and did not wipe my face. I did not raise my voice. I looked up at him, into eyes that had no idea they were looking at the man who now owned everything he had left, and let the silence stretch until it became its own kind of sound, heavy enough that even the band seemed afraid to fill it. 200 guests sat frozen in their chairs, no one certain yet whether to laugh, gasp, or simply look away. The entire tent holding its breath in the wake of something that had just gone further than anyone in that room except the two of us fully understood. Somewhere near the front, I saw Aubriella rise halfway out of her seat, one hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide with a horror that hadn't yet turned into anything else. Georgia sat frozen beside her, champagne glass suspended halfway to her lips. I let the frosting sit exactly where it had landed, cooling slowly against my skin, and reached instead into the inside pocket of my jacket, my fingers closing around the edge of the leather folder, my movements unhurried, almost gentle, the way a man moves when he has already decided the next several minutes belong entirely to him. The silence held for what felt like a full minute, though it could not have been longer than 5 or 6 seconds, the entire tent frozen in the particular stillness that follows a cruelty too large for anyone to immediately process. Zaire still stood in front of me, microphone loose in his hand, waiting for the laugh that hadn't fully arrived, and clearly confused about why it hadn't. The sound that finally broke the silence wasn't laughter. It was a chair scraping hard against the dance floor, loud and deliberate, from a table near the front, reserved for the evening's most prominent guests. I recognized the man rising from it immediately. Bentley Ahmed had built one of the largest community banking networks in North Carolina from a single branch his father had started decades earlier, and he was, as far as I knew, one of the few men in this tent whose net worth actually matched the confidence with which he carried himself. I'd known him for close to 15 years, sat across from him on 2 different charitable boards, though we'd rarely discussed either of our company's finances in any real detail at those meetings. Zaire had invited him as a trophy, a legitimizing prop meant to lend credibility to a groom desperate to appear connected to real money, entirely unaware that the trophy actually knew the one secret capable of ending him. Bentley's face had gone a deep, furious red. He tossed his napkin onto his plate and crossed the dance floor in long, purposeful strides, ignoring the startled guests he passed. His eyes locked entirely on Zaire. "Have you lost your mind?" Bentley's voice was a low roar cutting cleanly through whatever remained of the tent's stunned quiet. He didn't wait for an answer. He kept walking until he stood directly beside our table, close enough that Zaire instinctively took a half-step backward, nearly tripping over an empty chair in his retreat. "Bentley, I don't—" Zaire started, still smiling, still trying absurdly to salvage the moment, as though it were still his to control. "Do you have any idea," Bentley said, cutting him off entirely, "who you just put cake on?" Zaire blinked, genuinely confused, now glancing back toward me as though I might offer some explanation for why one of the wealthiest men in the state had just stormed across a dance floor on my behalf. "That man," Bentley said, pointing a thick finger directly at my chest, his voice rising to make certain every table in the tent could hear him clearly, "is Alden Benson. He owns Meridian Cold Chain. Not a controlling stake, Zaire. All of it. Every truck, every warehouse, every contract you spent your entire engagement dinner bragging about acquiring." He turned his glare on the room at large, on 200 guests now leaning forward in their seats, phones lowering, conversations dying mid-sentence. "The man you just called a broke deacon owns more refrigerated freight capacity than half the companies represented at this wedding combined."
The collective gasp that moved through the tent was audible, a physical ripple across 200 bodies simultaneously recalculating everything they thought they understood about the evening. George's champagne glass slipped from her fingers and shattered against the dance floor, though she didn't seem to notice or care, her wide eyes darting between Bentley, Zaire, and me, as though trying to determine which version of tonight she was now supposed to be performing. Zaire's face had gone the color of the tablecloth, every trace of his practiced confidence draining out of it in real time, his jaw working silently around words that weren't coming. "That's not—" Zaire started, his voice cracking on the second word. "There's obviously some confusion. I closed on that acquisition myself. I have documentation." "You have nothing," Bentley said flatly, his voice dropping lower, more dangerous now than the initial roar had been. "I've sat on Meridian's community advisory board for 6 years. I know exactly who signs those checks. And it isn't you." Zaire turned to look at me directly for the first time since the cake had left his hand, and I watched the last piece of his performance collapse in real time, watched him finally understand, standing frozen in front of 200 witnesses, exactly whose weekend he had spent humiliating. He opened his mouth, once closed it, and I saw his eyes flick briefly toward the tent's exits, the reflexive calculation of a man wondering for the first time all weekend whether there was still a version of tonight he could physically walk away from. I rose slowly from my chair, unhurried, the frosting still cooling against my collar, and reached into my jacket for the leather folder I'd been carrying since the alley behind the kitchen tents. 200 faces turned toward me in a single motion. Guests who had spent an entire weekend either ignoring me or laughing at me now, watching with the particular hunger of a crowd that senses it is about to witness something it will describe to other people for years. "Bentley's right," I said, my voice carrying easily now, into a silence so complete I barely needed to raise it at all. "And there's considerably more you should probably hear before this evening is finished." I let the folder rest against my palm for a moment, unopened, and looked directly at the man who, less than 24 hours ago, had been nothing more to me than a groom with a bad champagne bill and a trembling hand. He looked considerably smaller now, standing alone in the space he'd cleared for himself, at the center of 200 witnesses, waiting to discover exactly how much further this evening intended to fall. I threw the folder. It struck Zaire square in the chest hard enough that he stumbled back a step and burst open against the dance floor, at his feet spilling loan documents, bank statements, and forensic account summaries across the polished wood for 200 people to see. Somewhere behind me, I heard Bentley step back to give me room, the small, deliberate silence of a man who understood he'd already played his part, and the rest belonged to someone else. "Your empire is a phantom, Zaire," I said, my voice carrying easily now, every trace of the beaten, defeated man I'd played all weekend gone from it entirely. "There's no $50 million fund. There's no legitimate acquisition of anything. Rise Up Wealth is a shell with no assets, no real clients, and a personal cryptocurrency account you drained 18 months ago, trying to cover losses you never told a single investor about." A ripple of urgent whispering moved through the tent, several men reaching for their phones with the particular panic of investors who'd trusted him with real money. One older gentleman near the front stood up entirely, muttering something about calling his broker first thing in the morning, and sat back down only when his wife pulled sharply at his sleeve. 3 months ago, I continued, turning toward Aubriella for the first time, softening my voice only slightly. "You pawned your grandmother's diamond, the one you proposed with. You had a cheap substitute cut and mounted into the original setting so no one would notice the difference, and you used the cash to help cover the deposit on this very venue." Aubriella's hand rose slowly to her mouth. She looked down at the ring on her finger, as though seeing it for the first time, turning it once under the light, and I watched something break open behind her eyes. "That message you got at the engagement dinner?" I said quietly, just to her now, though the microphone Zaire had dropped somewhere on the dance floor was still live enough to carry it. "The one that upset you, and you put away so fast? I think you already suspected something, didn't you?" She didn't answer.
She didn't have to. The look on her face, caught somewhere between horror and a slow, sickening recognition, told me she'd spent all weekend trying not to hear whatever her own instincts had already been telling her. I would learn later, when there was room for it, that the message had come from a college friend who'd invested in an earlier version of Zaire's fund and lost nearly everything. A warning Aubriella had read at that dinner table and quickly convinced herself was simple jealousy dressed up as concern. She hadn't been wrong to want to believe him. She had only been unwilling in that single, unguarded moment to let herself consider that she might be right to worry. I turned back to Zaire, who had gone completely still, staring down at the scattered documents, as if they might somehow reorganize themselves back into the folder. "But the ring isn't the worst of it," I said, my voice hardening again. "3 weeks ago, you forged my daughter's signature onto paperwork appointing her co-trustee of Ruby Stone Baptist Church's pension fund. A position she never agreed to, never signed for, never knew existed. You used that forged appointment as collateral for a $4 million loan from an offshore lender, one that would have had full legal standing to seize that fund the moment your marriage was finalized tonight. 4 families in that congregation have already handed you their retirement savings after sitting through seminars you held in their own fellowship hall. Odessa Freeman is 83 years old, Zaire. She wired you $11,000 because you told her it was safe." The gasp that moved through the tent this time was louder than the first guests, turning to each other in open disbelief, several already standing, several already moving toward the exits with their phones pressed to their ears. I caught sight of the wedding planner near the tent's edge, frozen mid-stride with a tray of champagne flutes, apparently unable to decide whether her job description covered whatever this had become. "That debt you owe?" I said, closing the last distance between us. "The $4 million you begged an offshore lender for 48 more hours to cover in a garden on a burner phone the night before your own wedding? I bought it. All of it. As of this morning, you don't owe a faceless stranger anything anymore. You owe me, and I am calling every dollar of it due right now in front of everyone you spent this entire weekend lying to." I let that sentence sit in the air a moment, watching it land. "You want to know why I never flinched when you mocked my truck, my boots, my suit? Because a man who has genuinely built something never needs a room full of strangers to confirm it. You needed it every single hour of this weekend, and I imagine you've needed it every hour of your life." Zaire's legs seemed to give out beneath him all at once. He sank down onto the dance floor amid his own scattered paperwork, his tailored suit pooling awkwardly around his knees, the last of whatever confidence he'd built his entire adult life on, finally completely gone. He didn't look up at the guests, still standing frozen around him, or at Georgia, who had backed several steps away from the table, as though physical distance could somehow undo her association with what was unfolding. He looked only at Aubriella, his mouth working around words that weren't coming, a man who had run out of every lie he knew how to tell. I raised my right hand and let it fall in a single simple gesture, nothing more than a snap of my fingers, though it carried the weight of everything I'd spent the last 24 hours building toward. The tent had gone so quiet by then that even that small sound seemed to carry to every corner of it. At the far end, the heavy canvas flaps parted, and afternoon light spilled in around 5 figures moving down the center aisle with the unmistakable, purposeful walk of people who did not need to hurry to be taken seriously. Joshua led them, his charcoal suit immaculate despite the hour, flanked by 4 federal agents in dark tactical jackets, badges catching the light. Guests scrambled out of the aisle to clear a path, chairs scraping, several people pressing phones to their ears in a rush to describe what they were watching to whoever would listen. I recognized the look on more than a few faces, the particular mixture of shock and second-hand vindication of people who had spent the weekend uneasy about a man they couldn't quite name a reason to distrust. Joshua stopped a few feet from where Zaire still knelt among his scattered paperwork. "Warrants are secured," he said to me, handing a thick stack of documents to the lead agent. "Wire fraud, identity theft, forgery. The state regulator's office has also been notified, and Renata's already coordinating with them on the congregation's exposure." "Arrest him," I said, and my voice carried the full settled weight of a decision I'd made hours ago and simply waited to speak aloud. Somewhere behind me, I heard a woman's voice, unfamiliar, whisper to another guest that she'd invested with him too, and that she'd find out tonight exactly how much. The two lead agents crossed to Zaire and hauled him up by the arms. He didn't resist, didn't fight, simply let them pull him to his feet like a man whose body had stopped taking direction from him entirely. His tailored suit, rumpled and stained with frosting he'd never bothered to clean off, my own collar. As they turned him to fasten the handcuffs, his eyes found Aubriella one last time across the scattered ruin of the reception. "I'm sorry," he said, quiet enough that only those of us standing close actually heard it. No performance left in his voice at all. "I never had the courage to just tell you I needed help." The cuffs clicked shut before he could say anything else.
And the agents turned him toward the aisle, walking him out past 200 silent, staring guests, his expensive shoes dragging slightly against the floor with every step. Nobody applauded. Nobody laughed. The same room that had roared with delight when he'd shoved cake into my face barely an hour earlier now simply watched him go in a silence that felt, in its own way, like a verdict already delivered.
I watched him go, and I felt no satisfaction in the sound of that lock closing, only the quiet, settled certainty of a debt finally called due. Somewhere behind me, I heard Renata's voice on Joshua's phone, already coordinating with the regulator's office about the fastest path to returning Odessa Freeman's $11,000. A small practical mercy, already moving forward in the wreckage of everything else. Georgia found me before the tent had fully emptied, moving fast across the dance floor, with her heels clicking sharp against the wood, her face rearranged into something warm and eager that hadn't existed on it once in 3 days. "Alden." Her voice trembled with an entirely different kind of urgency than it had all weekend. "Darling, this is all so overwhelming. Why didn't you tell us who you really were? We could have planned something so much more fitting for you this weekend. We could have treated you properly, given you a real seat at the table. We're family after all." I looked at her for a long moment, at the calculation still visible just beneath the surface of her sudden warmth, already reaching for whatever version of me might still be useful to her. 30 years of marriage and divorce had taught me to recognize that particular expression instantly, the exact moment Georgia recalculated a man's worth and adjusted her posture accordingly. "You don't understand what family means, Georgia," I said, keeping my voice level, without anger, without satisfaction. "I gave you exactly the man you asked me to be all weekend. You never once asked whether I was all right. Not tonight, not in 15 years. You only ever asked what I could give you." I let that sit a moment, watching the last of her composure flicker. "You don't love a man, you love a wallet. You always have, and I imagine you always will." I didn't tell her the part that actually hurt, the part I doubted she would have understood even if I'd found the words for it. It wasn't the contempt she'd shown me all weekend, the whispered warning to stay near the back, the folded $100 bill pressed into my pocket like cab fare, the endless small cruelties dressed up as practicality. It was that in 15 years of marriage and 12 years of co-parenting since, she had never once, not a single time, asked me whether I was all right. I turned and walked toward Aubriella, leaving Georgia standing alone in the middle of a dance floor scattered with someone else's ruined evidence, and behind me, I heard her heels retreat quickly toward the parking lot, the sound growing smaller until the tent had gone almost entirely quiet. Guests slipping out in 2s and 3s into the fading light, leaving the wreckage of the reception to settle around the only 2 people who still had any real reason to stay. The tent had emptied almost entirely, caterers already beginning to clear glasses from abandoned tables, the string quartet long gone, the last of the daylight fading to a soft amber through the canvas walls. Aubriella sat alone at a table near the dance floor, still in her wedding dress, staring at nothing in particular. The marriage certificate she'd signed less than 2 hours earlier, now belonging to a man in federal custody. I crossed the empty space and pulled out the chair beside her, and for a long moment neither of us said anything at all. The silence between us, different from every other silence this weekend had held.
quieter, less guarded, closer to something that might eventually become peace. On the table between us sat the small mahogany box, still ringed with a faint water stain across the lid, where Zaire's whiskey glass had sat 2 nights earlier, the wood otherwise untouched by everything that had happened around it since. Someone, a caterer or a guest, must have moved it here at some point during the chaos. Aubriella reached out and touched the ring left in the wood, tracing it slowly with one finger. "Dad?" she said, finally, her voice smaller than I'd heard it all weekend. "I'm so sorry. I let them treat you like you were nothing this whole time. I saw what he did to this box and I didn't say anything." Her voice caught. "I didn't say anything about any of it." "You didn't know what you were looking at," I said gently. "None of us are as clear-eyed as we'd like to believe about the people we love." "That message," she said, and I understood immediately she meant the one from the engagement dinner. "It was from Marisol from college. She invested in one of Zaire's earlier funds 2 years ago and lost almost everything. She texted me that night to say she'd heard I was engaged to him and that I needed to be careful. I told myself she was jealous. I told myself she just couldn't stand to see me happy." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I think some part of me already knew. I think I've known for longer than I wanted to admit." I didn't offer her easy forgiveness for that because it wasn't mine to offer, and because I understood better than most exactly how long a person can carry a suspicion without letting themselves look directly at it. "You were trusting," I said instead. "That's not the same thing as foolish, whatever it feels like tonight." "How did you know?" she asked. "About all of it. How did you see what I couldn't?" "I didn't see it all at once," I said. "Small things one after another that didn't fit until they did. Your mother would tell you I've spent my whole life looking for the crack before it breaks. Tonight, for once, I'm glad that's true." She picked up the box and turned it over in her hands, really looking at it for the first time since I'd given it to her. "Where did the wood come from?" she asked quietly. "You never told me." I hesitated, the old habit of keeping things folded away rising up automatically. The same reflex that had cost me more than I'd ever fully admitted to myself. "It's from the floorboards of the truck I still drive," I said finally. "The one I bought secondhand, the year after your mother and I separated. I kept the offcuts from the restoration for 6 years before I understood what I was saving them for." "Why didn't you ever tell me that?" "Because my own father never told me much of anything," I said, and felt something loosen slightly in my chest as I said it. Some old, tired mechanism finally allowed to rest. "He lost his shop when I was 9. A bank decided he wasn't worth the risk, and I watched a man twice my father's size walk him out of that building like he was nothing. He never spoke about it again, not once, not to me or my mother." Aubriella went very still beside me. I had never told her this before. Not in 27 years, not once, through every birthday and graduation and quiet Sunday dinner we'd shared. There was more to the story than what I'd just given her, a great deal more, but it would keep for another day. Some things a man learns to hand over slowly, one careful piece at a time, the same way he'd learned to hold them close for far too long. I think I decided somewhere in that moment that the safest thing a man could do was carry his wounds alone and never hand them to anyone who might use them against him. I looked at her. "I've been doing that to you your whole life, Aubriella. I'm not certain I know how to stop entirely, but I'd like to try." She didn't say anything for a long moment. She simply moved her chair a few inches closer to mine and rested her head against my shoulder, the way she used to when she was small enough to fall asleep in the passenger seat of that same truck. She kept the water-stained box cradled in both hands and didn't try to put it away this time, didn't glance around the tent to see who might be watching. Neither of us spoke. The last of the caterers moved quietly around the emptying tent, and somewhere beyond the canvas walls, the sky had finally gone dark over Hayti, over the truck still parked exactly where I'd left it, over everything that still remained uncertain and unfinished between us. The mahogany box sits on the dashboard of my truck these days,
holding nothing but a spare set of keys and a photograph I still haven't shown anyone. Some Sunday mornings when Aubriella rides with me to Ruby Stone, I catch her glancing at it at a red light, and neither of us says a word. The water stain never came out of the wood. I never tried very hard to sand it away.
For most of my life, I believed silence was the safest way to love someone, that carrying the hard parts of my story alone would spare the people I cared about from ever having to carry them too. I built an entire fortune on that belief. I nearly lost a daughter to it. What I understand now, imperfectly and later than I would have liked, is that protecting someone by hiding from them isn't protection at all. It's just a quieter kind of distance. Real strength was never in what I could carry without anyone noticing. It was always going to be in what I was finally willing to set down in front of someone and let them help me hold. I think about that wedding tent often, the cake still cooling on my collar, 200 strangers holding their breath. I think about a congregation that could have lost everything and didn't. I don't believe any of that was luck. I believe God puts a quiet man in the right corner of the right room for a reason, and I believe God asks afterward what he intends to do with what he was allowed to see. I'm still answering that question, and I thank God for the time to keep trying. If you were sitting in that corner, cake on your face, the whole truth folded in your jacket pocket, would you have stayed quiet as long as I did? Or would you have said something the moment you first suspected? Tell me where you're watching from and what you would have done if this story meant something to you. Hit like, leave your answer in the comments, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. I read every word. Stay close to people.